So again, definitely have a notebook out for this video or your tablet or your laptop. It will not be as long as the last video. That was a 30-minute one, and I try not to make videos that long, as I've said to you before, because I know it's hard to sit through those. So even though I have my other hat on today because it's a little cold in our place, it's not going to take as long as the previous video did, where again I know it was like a half an hour to walk you through the databases. So in this one, I'm going to zero in a little bit more on Jamila Woods and on John Porcellino, and just some general suggestions on how to approach the writing of this paper, because I've had a lot of you ask very good questions. And the day I'm filming this, again, some of you have already started on this paper, and I've gotten some very good questions so far this semester on how to approach this. So first things first, before I get into any details, and I'm going to do a screen share in a minute, just to give you some suggestions in the database. First thing to remember is that the structure of the paper, the outline of paper 4 is the same. So that's not changed. All the work you did on paper 2 and on paper 3 in terms of introducing your ideas in the beginning, putting the quotations from the writers we were responding to in the first half of the paper, and then putting your analysis in the second half of the essay, all that's the same. So that makes, hopefully that makes that a little bit easier, because as I've said, the reason I give you all those papers in the first half of the semester is that that's all the preparation for the work we do here in the second half, so that you've got the basic idea of how most of your college papers would be structured, how you would use sources, how you would cite them. So now, because of all that practice you got in the first half of the semester, leading up to the midterm, now you can apply even more of that here in the second half. But as I've also mentioned, some of this assignment is also based on not just work you would do in other classes, and you'll have plenty of other classes where you're going to have to write papers, and that it doesn't matter what program you're in or what you want to major in. There's always going to be some kind of writing component to what you're working on for your major and your career goals, or your certificate if it's a certificate program that you're in. But some of you might also be taking English 102 in the spring semester. So that's why these assignments also have elements of that as well, so that you feel confident when you go into, again, any of those classes where more writing is being asked of you. So what we're going to do next here is take a look at some ideas of how to brainstorm for this paper, and also how to use that research from the databases. So I'm going to use the example of topic number 2. And I know I said in the last video that it doesn't matter which one of these you pick. It's really more about how you feel, where you feel your strengths are as a writer. And what I mean by that is that, if you feel like you would be better in paper 4 only focusing on Jamila Woods, then do topic number 1. If you feel like you tend to be better where you have a comparison or a compare and contrast type of a paper, topic 2 is the one for you. I mean, we're eventually, when we do the next quiz, which I'll announce, we're not going to do that yet. I really want you focusing on this paper for now. I'm going to ask you questions about John Porcellino, a couple about Cisneros and Jamila Woods. So you're going to have to read those readings anyway, for the quiz at the very least. But, again, I would encourage you to really think about doing number 2. If you're not sure, or you don't feel like you have enough to say about Jamila Woods for topic number 1, topic number 2 is more of a compare contrast sort of prompt. And again, I don't think that one is easier or harder than the other one. They both require the same amount of work. It's just that you have more of options with with topic number 2 if you feel that you're stronger as a comparative writer. So let's see. So again, I'm just going to use topic number 2 as an example. Let's say that I decided let's imagine I'm the student in this class, and I was a student in a class just like this, as I said, 30 years ago, in the fall of 1991. So I can remember writing papers like this. And again, in my case, I had to walk over to the library as it got later in the semester, which was not always fun in late October, November, up in the middle of Hanover, New Hampshire during that time of year. But anyway, we have all this technology now. So let's imagine for a second that I'm going to work on topic number 2. So here's what I would recommend doing if you're working on that topic. And that's the one where again, you still have to do research on Jamila Woods, because I've already given you the article on John Porcellino. So you don't need to look up anything on Porcellino if you're doing topic number 2, but you still have to find an article on Woods from the database. And the database, as I said, can get a little overwhelming because there's a lot of articles in there. You got to sift through them. You've got to make a determination as to which one you think would be most useful for your paper, and you only need one. So I've gone into the database. I've got it pulled up here on my screen. And so I'm not going to go through all those other steps of getting into the database because that's in the previous video. And I don't want to make, again, this one too long. But here I am in the Chicago Tribune. I've already opened that up. And one thing you have to remember when you're doing the search for this is if you come across a couple of articles and you read them and you say to yourself, like, oh, I don't know, this is not, it's too vague. It doesn't have specifics on, why she would have written these papers. Let me show you something maybe that you could take a look at that you're welcome to use that also have a lot of good information from them. I'm a big fan, or I should say I've become a big fan, not just of the Greg Kot ones. You'll even notice in my search engine here, you can see that I've already looked up Jamila Woods, Greg Kot, right? But I remember in having, I've assigned this a few times now. I've taught Jamila Woods for the last couple of years, but I started doing more with the database last year. And I recall that the articles that were very useful, again, especially if you're trying to narrow them down a little bit, are some of the ones written by a reporter named Josh Terry. So I'm doing a search on Josh Terry. Oh, it didn't come. Let me reset this here for a second. And this may happen too. You may be doing a search like this and you don't get the first hit, and that can happen. That's okay. Just do it again. I put Jamila Woods in here. And I'm curious to find, even when I'm in here, let's look up Jamila Woods, Josh Terry, because some of those are really good articles. And actually, to be honest, I already have one of them pulled up, but I wanted to actually do the search with you. Jamila Woods, Josh Terry. Okay, let's see what this comes up with. May take a second. There are some very good articles by Josh Terry. And the reason that they're so good, like this one called Just Like Heaven, Jamila Woods is one of Chicago's most multifaceted musicians. This one here, very good interview, Jamila Woods is one of Chicago's most multifaceted musicians. So these are separate. The interview one is separate. These are slightly different, or they were published at a different time. But one of the great things about this article, again, if you're still trying to figure out which one to use, I highly recommend this one. Now, here's why I highly recommend it. In having had other students do this assignment last year, a lot of people did a nice job with this article. You'll notice it's a little more substantial than the Greg Kot ones. That's because it's also got interview material with her in it. So we learn about, you're going to get the name of the high school that she went to, that she talks about deep in the homeroom of doom. You're going to learn more about her neighborhood in Chicago. You're going to learn more about young Chicago authors. I've talked with a couple of you about that I've had Zoom meetings with, which was the after school program that gave her a sense of inspiration and encouragement when she was younger and thought about becoming a poet or a singer or a writer. She even talks about going to her grandma's church when she was a kid and learning partly how to sing and how to learn music through the church. And if you've never been to an African-American church, I actually played in a band for a little bit with a bassist and a drummer who were members of a church on the west side of the city. And I forget what the name of the church was. And having been raised Catholic, I'd gone to mass plenty of times, but I'd never been to an African-American Baptist church. And it was some of the most fun I've ever had. The music was phenomenal. The service was great. Everybody was very welcoming. And if you said, oh, I don't know how to sing very well, they said, it doesn't matter. Come along and here's the missal and sing along with us. That's the kind of world Jamila Woods came out of musically as well. But this is also an article, and I've talked again with a couple of you over Zoom about this. She even talks about all the bands that she listened to when she was in high school, and I think she's in her early 30s. So we're talking maybe early 2000s or so, mid 2000s, where she was listening to bands that stereotypically would be considered, the bands that the punk rock kids or the white kids listen to. But in her high school, because she was, as we know, one of the few African-American students, she was absorbing all this information. It actually reminds me a lot of my high school. My high school where I grew up was actually pretty diverse. We had a really great mixture of different students from different walks of life and different backgrounds. And I actually do remember the kids in my high school, whether you were Asian American or African American, or you were a white kid, or you were an immigrant kid, everybody listened to the same music. We all listened to hip hop and we listened to punk rock and metal. I mean, I'm sounding nostalgic. This was in the late 80s, and I went to a city high school where I'm from in Connecticut. So it was fun to learn about all those different kinds of music from all those different kinds of kids. Anyway, I mentioned all this stuff because all of that is here in this article from Josh Terry about Jamila Woods. A lot of good information about her background, what it was like to grow up, what it was like to face the racism issues that she did as a kid, what it was like to try to fit into that high school that she went to, where she probably was one of the few African-American kids who was there, and so had a hard time fitting in. The whole part about deciding where she would go to college, it's all in this article. And I mention all that because that means as you're researching this paper and you're deciding which poem to write about, this will help you to decide which of the poems you might want to analyze and respond to in the second half of the paper. Because guess what? This poem, Deep in the Homeroom of Doom, is about her high school. The poem that she wrote about her dad is more about her grade school years and how it was to grow up with a father who was successful, but as a lot of you said in your midterm, wasn't just, unfortunately, not accessible, not home all the time. So where did she take all this inspiration from? How did she decide to go to Brown University? If we describe her as a Chicago writer, what does that mean? What are her Chicago roots? And in her case, it means her community, her friends from high school, the diversity of the friends that she had from high school. But it also means the positives and the negatives of growing up in Chicago, dealing with some of those issues of racism, having to work within the challenge of not seeing her father, whom she admires, but he's not there all the time. So all of those are things that inspire you as a poet. Remember, if you're a writer, your inspiration doesn't always come from positive things. And inspiration can also come from the struggles you had to face, that you had to move through. And I think she's a great example of that, as are a lot of other Chicago poets, by the way. And here's where I want to mention John Porcellino again, to put a plug in for possibly having you consider doing topic 2 if you haven't thought about it yet or haven't decided. Porcellino is a kid who was born in Chicago. He's an Italian-American kid. I think his grandparents, I'm forgetting the exact details. His parents are definitely Italian-American. Maybe his grandparents were immigrants. I'm not sure. We'd have to ask him. I'm sure if you emailed him, he might answer that question. He's actually pretty accessible. But here's a kid. If you read Belmont Harbor and you read Celebrated Summer, all these stories are about that time period between when he graduates from Hoffman High and he's about to get ready to go to Northern Illinois University for college. So he's already into Northern. He knows he's going to go there. Some of these details are mentioned, but he's struggling with a lot of mental health issues. Later on in his life, when he's well into his late 20s, early 30s, he gets diagnosed with pretty severe OCD disorder, which causes a lot of other anxiety disorders on top of it. So that's in another one of his books. He talks about that, getting diagnosed with pretty bad OCD. But you can see the depression here and the anxiety that he's dealing with, especially in some of the scenes in Celebrated Summer. Now, Porcellino considers himself a poet as well. So he just happens to write his poetry in the form of comics, in the form of these little short stories, because he was trained as a painter. So he was trained in painting at Northern Illinois when he went there for college in the late 80s. So I look at these two writers, Jamila Woods and Porcellino, as being very similar. They actually have a lot of similarities because in the same way that she was dealing with some of the racism issues at her high school and as a kid growing up in her neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, there's a lot of bullying going on in this story. If you read the Porcellino carefully, you notice that he does have friends that he's close to, but at the same time, he's also got those kids in his gym class who are bullying him or making fun of him. And so I think what you're seeing in this is both of these writers are really writing autobiographically because they're Chicago or originally from Chicago. In Porcellino's case, they write very simply. They write with a lot of humor. There's no fanciness. It's very direct. It's funny. It's supposed to be welcoming. It's supposed to welcome you so you can imagine the kind of stories that they're telling. And both of them are facing some dilemmas in terms of comparison. If you read the interview with Rob Clow, for example, that I posted, again, I'm imagining, let's say you were thinking about doing topic number 2. Clow has a whole section of this interview. If you go through and you search for, I'll show you the screen share here. If I were using this article, what I would do is, go through here. I don't know if my update, here we go, I'm looking for my find function. I would type in Chicago. So like what does Porcellino say about Chicago in this interview? And I would do that word search. And there's a whole section in here where he talks about watching the Bears games with his dad. There's also a section in the Porcellino interview where he talks only about Perfect Example. That's the book, by the way, that I took the 2 stories from. So he tells you how he wrote these stories and he tells you about those Chicago connections. I'll give you one more example. In the same way that in that Josh Terry article, Jamila Woods talks about young Chicago authors. Well, here you go. Here, look at John Porcellino in this article talking about sports in Chicago. He's a Bears fan. His late father was a Bears fan. And so he talks about having those links with his father. So you see that impact that the Chicago area has on these writers, good and bad as they grow up, right? And so anyway, I'm showing you that because doing a comparison of these two writers, if you chose to do that for topic number 4, again, you don't have to, is not as hard as it might seem, because they're both people who were young. They decided they wanted to be artists or writers. They faced various problems. In Porcellino's case, he was suffering with this undiagnosed anxiety disorder, which I can tell you as someone else who I'm younger than Porcellino, but I was born in 73 and mostly grew up in the 80s. And there was not the awareness of mental health issues that we have today. And thank God we have more awareness today, because I'll tell you, when I was a kid, any friends of mine that I had who had anxiety issues, or what we now think of as OCD issues, it's hard to get help because people didn't want to talk about it. And the help was not as good as what we have today. So anyway, I mention all that because in the same way she was dealing with those issues of race and issues of class, because, you know, she goes to this high school and all these other kids have all this fancy clothes on. If you've read Deep in the Homeroom of Doom, same thing here. But in Porcellino's case, his family moves out from the city. He eventually goes to Hoffman High, and he just doesn't fit in because he's a musician. He's an art, he's a painter, and he's not quite sure what he wants to do with his life yet. So he has some friends, but you'll see in the gym class, he gets made fun of and bullied a little bit. One of his friends, though, saves his life in Celebrated Summer. I won't give too much of that away if you haven't read it. But I think both of these are stories or poems about young artists from the greater Chicago or Chicago area finding themselves and facing both obstacles and opportunities. And that's why I like to teach them together. And in this case, you're just doing more research on Jamila Woods, because again, there's a lot of other material on Porcellino, but he's sort of like a secondary sort of source if you decided to do topic number 2 here. So let me stop my screen share and just go back. And like I said, this has probably still gone on longer than I anticipated, but I wanted to kind of cover all this. As I said, I'm biased. I really enjoy doing research, as slow as a writer as I am. I like learning about new things. So when I have a topic that I don't know much about, like a new writer or an artist, or, back in the day when I was getting my doctorate and I had to take educational psychology classes or pedagogy classes, I always enjoyed that because I like learning new stuff. I feel like I don't know if I always have the best understanding of things when people teach them to me, but I like, I just like learning new things. So in the case of this paper, number 4, your job, think of it this way, is you've read Jamila Woods, you read her for the midterm, you've got these other poems you've read. So now your job in going into the database is to discover more about her, but make it concrete. How did she grow up? What was high school like for her? What was it like to do those after school programs? How did she decide she was going to go to Brown University and focus on becoming a poet? So that's really the focus. That's the kind of material you want to find. So the Josh Terry articles are really good for that. The Greg Cott ones are good. Those by no means are the only good articles in the database. But again, those are ones I know in the past students have said, wow, these were really helpful. I learned more about her. And I've even had students say, wow, I even enjoy her work now even more because I read more about her through doing this little bit of research. And that's the goal with this assignment, to do the research, take your time with it, which is why I've encouraged you to start it as soon as possible. Because as you can see, there's just more moving parts, finding the article, deciding which article is good, which one maybe wouldn't work as well, and then putting the information together. Okay, so that's my little video for today, just on encouraging you to have fun while you're doing this research. Reach out to me for help. Hopefully some of these suggestions were useful, both on Woods and on Porcellino. And in the next video, I'll just give you more suggestions and reminders. I almost got Rosie to be in this one, but she was having lunch when I started filming this. And I think now she's walked back to bother my wife, who is in the front of our little condominium here, and I think she's on a meeting, actually. I can hear her, so I don't think she and Rosie are talking. Anyway, hope you have a great rest of the day whenever you watch this video. Please email me with any questions on paper number 4, and I look forward to seeing the research you do for this essay. Talk to you later. Bye.